What follows is an intriguing and insightful conversation with an awarded historical fiction author and Renaissance man as he joins us to go over his journey so far, including the hardest parts of being a novelist. His books and short stories have garnered recognition, including the Montana Prize in Fiction in 2009, Best American Mystery Stories in 2010. This is all on his website. Finalist at the, and I'm going to say this wrong if I try, so I'll spell it MACHIGONNE Fiction Contest in 2012, which is awarded by Newt Gard. He was a finalist for the Doris Betts Fiction Prize in 2014, which is awarded by the North Carolina Literary Review. He was a finalist in the short story category of the 2015 International Book Awards. It was awarded my favorite book most likely to renew your faith in short stories for his book In the Season of Blood and Gold. And most importantly, most recently, he was named the author of the year for his novel Pride of Eden in 2021 by the Georgia Writers Association. He's the author of Fallen Land, The River of Kings, Gods of Howe Mountain, and of course, Pride of Eden. And upcoming, he has a book that is due out next year, 2022, called Wingwalkers, which he goes through fairly in depth during our conversation. His novels, especially Fallen Land, take you back to a scarcely understood time in American history, as in Fallen Land, which took place in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and the main characters are civilians. His detailed and in-depth account of that time period in the context of a compelling story taught me as much about Georgia history as any account I've ever read or studied. On top of his writing, he's a motorcycle and cycling aficionado and more. He's a preschool classmate. So, after a haircut, going back in time to this conversation, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Taylor Brown. It goes without saying that us classmates of yours have a lot to be proud of in your regard because I can tell you've put in a lot of work. That Fallen Land is an incredible story. You're currently still writing Wingwalkers. Why don't you just tell me about that?
So Wingwalkers, I am done pretty much with Wingwalkers, just done with the proofreading and all that stuff. We get the final jacket copy and all that in the next week, I think. So it's really almost done in terms of the production aspect of it, and then it comes out in April 2022. So April next year, April 19th, I think. So all the we're already starting doing some of the kind of promotion and stuff like that with it. So yeah, but they take a long time. I started Wingwalkers, I think in 2015 is when I really started it. So, they take a long time to write, and then it takes, pretty long time to kind of get it from there into print, even if you've got a publishing house, that you're used to working with and that, wants the book, so it's kind of a long timeline.
So 2015, you have an idea. How does it start?
They're all different. I think that for me, a lot of them, for some reason, a lot of my novels have started with short stories. And some novelists like to write short stories, and I have other friends who are novelists that hate writing them because it is a different form and very different. And the jump between them is not necessarily smooth or easy, or one doesn't necessarily lead into the other. But for me, what's happened a lot of times, I've always really enjoyed short stories. And so I would have just an idea. I mean, they've come from all different things. I just feel like and I tell people this is one of the unexpected advantages or boons of being an author, or maybe an artist in general, is that it gives you an excuse to have your antenna up and to be attentive to your world all the time, and to be curious and interested in ways that you might not be, because you've always kind of got your ear open for a story. So it might be a story someone tells me, an anecdote, it might be just an image that I see somewhere, it might be a turn of phrase. Just there's usually some seed or little nugget, and I just kind of run with whatever is happening with that in my head, and maybe that turns into a short story. And sometimes the characters or the story seems bigger than a short story length of 8 to 12 pages, and then so I just start running with something that turns into book length, that I start already envisioning this is going to be, a book length project. So, yeah, they've all started in different ways. Wingwalkers, I'm not exactly sure where that first place, where it really the first idea came, but I know of where it really started to burn brightly for me was in early 2016. My first book, Fallen Land, that we already mentioned, came out, and I was on book tour, and I went to Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi for the first time. And Square Books is in Faulkner's hometown, and a lot of Oxford has a history of all of these amazing writers coming out of that town or coming to that town and being part of Ole Miss and their writing program, or just living there. There are a number of writers that just live there that are really good. And Square Books is one of the, to me, the most historic, legendary bookstores in the South, if not the country. And it's full of all this memorabilia. And I was just kind of walking around in there, checking it out, taking in the history. And on the landing, there's an upstairs and a downstairs. And on the landing, I see this like shadow box on the wall, like a glass-faced presentation case. And inside is this photograph that I recognize as being William Faulkner, only not the white-haired Faulkner with a meerschaum pipe who won the Nobel Prize. Not that Faulkner we're used to seeing. This was a young Faulkner who looked like a teenager, and he was dressed in an RAF uniform, with like the peak hat kind of on to the side, and he had a cane, and he had, he's smoking a cigarette. It was like stuck right out the side of his mouth. And it was just this kind of dashing figure. And next to it was an old regimental tie and some old Royal Air Force wings, like a patch from a uniform, and then a drawing of 3 different sides of a World War I biplane, which was in Faulkner's own hand. And I'd already heard these stories that Faulkner had been interested in he was interested in flight and airplanes. You're talking, he's around at the beginnings of flight, right? I mean, I forget what year now. I should know what year he's born, but I think that he was born right before 1900. So he's growing up in the real age that flight's taking place. And so when World War I happens, he is, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 or 20, and he goes off. He wants to be a fighter pilot. And at that point, the United States hadn't entered the war, and he went off to Canada to join the Royal Air Force. And he came back after the war. He was not ever sent to France. And as far as we know, it remains dubious whether he even soloed and earned his wings in training, but he came back to Oxford wearing, a RAF uniform and telling people that he had a plate in his head. He said it was the only medal they ever gave him. And he was affecting a limp, that he said he got from a crash, and all of these tall tales that, in some ways, I guess I found really endearing. It almost seemed as if his imagination was too big for his own life, right? And these tales made their way into his work, and especially his early work. His short stories have a lot of flying in them. His early books, like Flags in the Dust, do. And so I was just fascinated by this kind of buried part of his life that most people don't know anything about, right? And and I have a history, as my dad was a pilot, and we both have some, flying history in our past. And so it was just interesting to me, and it started to the book started to roll from there. I was interested, and so he's a character in the book, actually, which was both difficult and actually really enjoyable to me to take, a literary hero and icon and try to get inside his head and write from his perspective a little bit.
Yeah. So the protagonists, though, are the couple, right? So he's not
Yes.
actually the protagonist.
He's like the other protagonist. I would say it alternates chapters between this couple who are barnstormers, and then Faulkner. Typically, it's more like his chapters are shorter, a little bit more concise, a little bit more anecdotal. They're slices of his life, typically from that aviation perspective, because that kind of gave them a form, right? I didn't want to write some kind of fictional biography of him, but I was interested in this part of his life and how it shaped him. Yeah, and the seed of it comes from, I was reading his biography, and he went to the opening of the Shushan Airport in 1934 in New Orleans, which is now the lakefront airport. Next time you're in New Orleans, I highly recommend going. It's this Art Deco masterpiece. They redid it in the last decade, I think, since Katrina, and it's just beautiful. But it never turned into what they thought it would be. They were calling it the new air hub of the Americas, that this was going to connect North America and South America, and this was going to be the big airport, the big aerial hub of the country, really. And so when they opened it in 1934, they had air races, they had, air shows, they had all the stuff, and Faulkner was there. And I found this licensed biography where it talks about he came home during that, and it opened during Mardi Gras in 1934. So it is a huge to do. Mardi Gras, the parade had aerial themes in it. It was conquest of the sky. People had done up floats. The big crews had done aerial themed floats. And in his biography, it talks about he came back home, or he didn't come home one night he was staying with friends of the family, this reporter for one of the local journals there. And he comes home the next morning and he's hungover, and over breakfast, he tells this wild tale of spending the night, carousing and hanging out with this couple from the air show, who were aviators in the air show, and were riding a motorcycle. And we don't really know anything about the night that he spent with them in the French Quarter and what all happened and who they were. And so that piqued my interest. That was the story waiting to be told for me. Then I was interested in reimagining who they were and how their lives kind of intersected with his. So yeah, and then it's during the Great Depression, so there's a lot of interesting, the milieu, the background of it all is really interesting. So yeah, that's how it kind of all came together.
This couple's mentioned in his biography. Did you do any extra research on them, or were you able to find out anything factual past what's mentioned in the biography?
No, I could never even find their names, which I was glad, to be honest, because if I found out who they were, I wouldn't be free to create and reimagine who they were, right? And I wouldn't probably be able to find very much about them. So I let them be, for the most part, creations of my imagination, but largely informed by some people that Faulkner did know, and what it was very much. I did a ton of research on what their lives would have been like in that era, on barnstormers, on the husband had been a World War I pilot, on all of those kinds of things. What his experiences would have been like, and so I was kind of glad, because it was this missing piece that I could fill in. I was free to create kind of who they were, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
The way
great.
that fiction gives you that freedom, right? If I've found out their names and stuff, I've always felt a little funny about that, right? You can get away with it. You can tell a fictional story about using the real names and say that it's okay, but typically I would either rather have someone like Faulkner that we all know that we don't know exactly what he was thinking, or have someone that is not a real person, but not something quite in between. So yeah.
That's fascinating, and I wonder. It makes me wonder how far you went. Like, how far did you go trying to find out who they were?
I would say that I probably read most everything that I could get my hands on that would have probably said. So I think that I would say I went pretty far. I wasn't trying to find them necessarily, but I was reading what was out there about Faulkner's flying experience, his experience in New Orleans around that time, various different Faulkner biographies, the memoirs of his brothers, all of whom ended up being pilots. The memoir of his niece. You know what I mean? There's a lot of stuff out there. And because it wasn't something that would have turned up in the paper or anything, because it was just him probably running into some people and hanging out with them like you do during Mardi Gras in New Orleans, there's pretty, there's not likely to be that much on the record about them. He wrote a book called Pylon based on his experiences, a novel based on his experiences um, at the same thing at the Shushan airport, and it's largely regarded as not one of his great novels at all. And he wrote it in like 6 weeks apparently, and got his editors were mad at him because he did very little editing on it, and he didn't want to change anything. And he knew another couple that was separate, that the Omleys, and they were out of Memphis, and they were a barnstorming couple. The the wife had been the country's first female to earn a commercial transport license, I believe. She also set records for, I believe, skydiving from the highest, altitude, and she became underneath. She became very high up. I forget what her position was in like the early civil aeronautics, like basically the governmental body for aviation in the United States. And so most people think that he based the characters in that book off of them, but if you know their history and you know what's in that book, it doesn't really line up that much. So it did make me wonder whether the characters in that book were somewhat inspired. So I had that in my head too,
But if he can kind of extrapolate on what he knows about those people and make it fictional, so can you.
Yeah, exactly.
But that book, Steal Like an Artist. Not saying in no way are you stealing, but I'm sure you've heard that philosophy before.
Absolutely. Great artists, no, good artists borrow, great artists steal, or something like that. Is, I think T.S. Eliot was the one that said it. And it also reminds me, I have another friend who, has quoted, I don't know if this was his quote, so I don't want to say, but I remember Matthew Neil Knoll, who's a writer whose work I really enjoy, and he said, books are made of other books. And I do think that that is largely true, and books are largely kind of a conversation too between not just the author and the reader, but I think sometimes the author and the other books and the other authors that they've read, many of whom have passed away. And so this is one of the only ways to almost have this kind of conversation. And to me, fiction does give you that freedom. I mean, fiction is full of great, big, beautiful lies, that, and it gives you that freedom to create those tales, those tall tales,
At the same time, I mean, I want to give you all due credit here, because it's not like, if you're listening out there, it's not like you can go through a bunch of books and then patchwork a story together and then call yourself a fiction writer.
Yeah.
Land, I was so impressed, and not to totally come off of Wingwalkers, but I was so impressed that the level of detail and historical accuracy that you put into Fallen Land was incredible. It made me like living in Georgia more. It made me appreciate living in Georgia more. It made me want to know more about civilian life during the post-Civil War, immediate post-Civil War. That's not, when you think about the Civil War, you think about any war, most accounts that we know about are about the war and what it was like to be in the war. But Fallen Land is about what it was like to be a civilian.
Yeah, that was really and especially it seems like the Civil War, when we think about the Civil War, and especially into the last few years, it really, you think about big ranks of people in gray and blue uniforms coming together on battlefields, right? Like that is the quintessential experience that we have historically seen in books and movies and those sorts of things. Not to exclusion, but that is, the major thing. And I just became interested in what it was like, to be home and to be, for instance, a mother at home with multiple children and not know when if your husband is alive and when he's going to be home, and if he'll ever come home, and or to be, and the dangers of being unprotected, to some degree on, land that now there's not you're all the males in the family are gone off to fight. So who is around to potentially, provide a little bit more security? You know, just the battle at home is such, you know, so intense, and maybe we overlook that, a little bit. Um, and I think I was interested. You know what made me interested in that too with Fallen Land was when you realize how, especially in the mountains of, for instance, Western North Carolina, where Fallen Land begins, this was not so clearly gray and blue. It was not so clearly Confederate and Union. It was very broken up and faction. You know, there are all these little factions, right? So you could be living in a cabin up there and have one day have Confederate riders come through that want you to tell them who you've seen and feed them and water their horses. And maybe a couple days later, Union riders come through. And then there's people on both sides that are deserters, that are outlaws, and you're just out there on your own trying to navigate all these potentially threatening forces that are coming through, right? Um, and how difficult that is. And I think about being living in Afghanistan, and one day the Marines roll through with their Humvees, and they're giving out candy and they want intelligence and they're trying to make alliances, and I have multiple friends that that was their job over there. But they also had to worry because not too much after the Taliban might roll through and might have been watching and seen who you talk to, and you know what I mean? And so you are so caught in between powers that have, that you can feel very powerless under. And I think that was something that was really interesting to me that I ran with Fallen Land. Was that the kind of being a civilian trapped at home in the middle of a war zone, then you're just trying to survive and keep food on the table, and keep the animals alive and worry about the crops and all of that.
That's such an interesting parallel, how during the Civil War, surviving as a civilian during the Civil War in the way that you described required a lot of the same skills that a lot of these Afghan civilians have had to employ.
Mm-hmm.
Human condition at
Mm-hmm.
work in a situation that's
Mm-hmm.
pretty fucking shitty, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also very revealing. So that,
Mm-hmm.
man, that's really cool to think about.
That's
So
one of the things I love about a historical setting is the way that it can talk about the present at a slant with, like, they talk about cognitive dissonance, right? It's that little bit of distance, that little bit of cognitive, having, it's just it's different, right? It is different. It's a different time and they're different people. I'm not trying to necessarily equate those wars or anything, but there are parallels in the human condition. And sometimes when you see, um, you can take a historical context, and one, it shows us some of the same issues and problems and uh, hardships of the human condition that unfortunately, uh, continue to go on and on, 100 years later and 100 years after that. But also, I think that there's something that can be unifying and give comfort to see that, just to see these parallels in a little bit of a different way. I guess it can help you to see your own present more clearly by seeing the past or something.
for sure, to just acknowledge that you're not alone in the way you feel. You're not the first person or the last person's ever felt this way. Who of your characters do you feel like you relate to more than the others?
That's a good question. I think that when I look back over the various books, most of the time when I was writing them, I haven't necessarily felt that close of a connection. I've never been quite as interested personally in writing fiction that is thinly veiled autobiography, which, and there is a lot of fiction that I do enjoy that is like that. A lot of Hemingway's work, was like that, for instance. The funny thing is that in some ways I used to kind of take pride almost in the fact that I thought that I was writing characters that took a greater leap of imagination and empathy to get inside of. And then, so because I thought, take Fallen Land, for instance, right? This is such a clear example of this. So Fallen Land to me seems to like it has very little to do with my life, right? The main character, the male main character is a 15-year-old Irish horse thief who falls in with this band of outlaw deserter marauders and then rebels against them and goes on this journey um, with a girl who had been raped and has gotten pregnant, and they're trying to make their way to the Georgia coast um, to find some safety in the wake of Sherman's March. And to me, that had very little to do with my own life. But as I look back, I realized that I moved to Asheville right before I started writing that book. This was 2009, I think. And I moved there, and I originally had a job, my same job that I had in California. I was going to work remotely, and it just didn't work anymore, and I quit. And I decided to start my own business at the same time. And pretty soon, and we had rented this house. And the woman, when we rented it, was close to downtown Asheville, and the woman had said that it was an old whorehouse. And we kind of laughed about it. I mean, we thought she meant from 100 years ago when that would have been a more normal thing to be around, right? And it was like this redone. It wasn't really big or anything. It was just this redone like craftsman's, bungalow type thing. And I remember in the first 2 weeks that I was there, I think like 10 people got arrested right on the street in front of the house. Right. It was like, and people were rattling the gate in the middle of the night. And I realized that what she meant by whorehouse was a little bit different. This was probably a drug house and still thought of it as that. And this was not a good part of town. And then we had no money and it was cold and there were rats in the house. And we had this one dog, Waylon, that, was kind of like our guardian animal. And now I look back at Fallen Land and I see two young people who are trying to make their way towards some kind of safety in a cold and scary world with an animal to depend on, right? With the single animal that they love to depend on, which in the book is the horse, Reaver. But now I see the ways in which I see some of those parallels that I never saw when I was writing it, to be honest. So it's funny how that kind of thing works out, Since then, I would say that I did with Wingwalkers, there were ways in which I could identify with Faulkner in terms of getting inside him long before he became the Faulkner that we know. But, growing up as full of imagination, telling stories, being a creative person when you're not necessarily as a male in the South, especially in his time, but still that's not necessarily, it's not the easiest place to be. You feel like a little bit of an outsider. I wasn't all of my, I didn't really play sports, the athletic aspect, just feeling like a little bit of an outsider and then trying to have this dream of, writing books and being a writer and trying to make that happen. So there were ways in which I could kind of identify with that, I think.
And we should offer the caveat that it's not because you chose not to play sports. You made the best out of a situation that was challenging growing up.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, for people that don't know, I was born with club feet on both sides and had a bunch of surgeries related to that would have made athletics very challenging. And I spent a lot of time after surgeries at home, kind of on not bed rest, not house arrest, but stuck at home sometimes a couple times for a whole summer, basically. And I just read books. Sometimes I read a book a day. And so I think that probably built me into who I am today to a large degree. So I'm very thankful for it, actually. Y'all got the special inserts made for your golf shoes because you spend so much time on your feet.
Uh-huh.
And those were revolutionary for me, to be honest. Those special made inserts, because they distributed my weight in such a way inside my shoes that I quit break, because I would get a break, those metatarsal, those foot bones, just stress fractures, but over and over and over again. And you probably remember in high school, I'd be on crutches.
Yeah, I do.
Like all the time, right? Yeah. And those inserts, which came about around the time that I first got a pair when we were probably 18 or 19. And that was around the time I had my last surgery too, I think senior in high school. And those changed things a lot. And now I've discovered some boots that actually don't wear those insoles in, but somehow do the same thing. And to be honest, I wear motorcycle boots now, and they are built so tough because they have steel shanks and all this stuff to protect you if you're in an accident. But what's so great about it for me is that they don't warp in such a way that it is able to change the weight distribution on my feet, and I'm able to walk in a much more balanced way on them, I think, and they last a lot longer too. Because I used to go through a pair of hiking boots in 6 weeks. It would wear out because I would walk so much on the outside of the shoes that it would wear the sole down, and then I'd put heel tacks on them, but still the upper part of the shoe would warp such that when your foot is in it, the upper part of the shoe over the sole is hanging over the sole too much. And then you have knee problems, and then you have hip problems and all that stuff. So, I only bought those for riding motorcycles, and then realized I could walk in them great.
I always knew you was like a smart guy. I read your papers in high school and we had to trade and read papers in English class. And I knew that you were a good reader and writer, but that's so fascinating about how you stayed home and read books. And that was kind of like almost a head start on your 10,000 hours, if we're going to get that out to talk about
Right.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I think so, probably to some degree,
so you went to San Francisco and you kind of, I don't want to call it a real job, but you had an office job, and then Asheville, and you started your own business. At some point in your author journey, there was probably a lot of uncertainty that you dealt with, and you kind of prevailed here.
Mhm.
When was that, and what was the situation like?
Well, I would say that the uncertainty is still not gone. That's one thing that I've learned is that in the creative arts, I kind of thought that, as you have more books out, it would get easier. I would say that it doesn't necessarily get easier. It changes, but I would say that the uncertainty, is still there. The doubts don't go away. And in some ways I'm thankful for that because it keeps you sharp. Right. And it keeps, I certainly have rarely felt like, you think of people and they start to get toward our age and they start to feel like they just have been living lives that, like they haven't, like they're in like a zombie mode, right? And they're just kind of like going through the motions, and it doesn't feel like that, it still feels like I'm out on the edge sometimes, maybe a little bit more often than I would like, in terms of it's not an easy life, I mean, even if my books have been well reviewed and have, sold decently well, but we're not living in the age when, for the most part, very few even well-reviewed literary books sell enough copies to make you very comfortable financially, right? So that's always a thing. I mean, I run a business at the same time. I have I have two basically full-time jobs that, and I like that because I can't really write. I couldn't write 8 hours a day. It's just not humanly possible for me to write the kind of way that I want to write. But um, luckily I'm okay with having, kind of two full-time jobs because I'm still, it's still necessary to a large degree. But oh yeah, I mean the uncertainty, um gosh, I don't even know where to start. I mean it's I think it just comes with the territory if you want to, um well, anything you want to do. I mean, it's not that much different than when I've started businesses too, and you're just to a large degree operating on faith. I mean, that is a word that I've come back to with it a lot. I don't necessarily feel um, a super strong, traditional religious faith, but just the faith that your hard work, your focus, your um, hours that you're putting in, the sacrifices that you're making, just the willpower, the power of will to get better at what you're doing and to make what you're doing a success, that will pay off. That faith is one that gets tested still, I think, for me on a daily basis, and has been with me for, most all of this journey. Um, I really started writing in earnest fiction um, my last year of college. And I think that a lot of people think that writing is, a lot of people want to write books or want to, publish and those kinds of things. And I think that most people don't realize how tough it's going to be. I was lucky because I did realize, simply because when I did have that office job, most people, we were working on a computer, a lot of stuff with spreadsheets and all this stuff where you could listen to something at the same time. And most people listen to music, and I did some too, but I also found this repository of interviews. And it was a man out of New York that had a radio show, and he interviewed authors of all different genres, both very high level literary authors, all the way to, big bestsellers. They're writing kind of like genre stuff, horror and science fiction and all that. And he interviewed zillions of people, and just about anybody who is alive and writing and publishing whose name that we might know now. He interviewed them at least once, it seemed like, between 1980 and 1990 something. And unfortunately, that repository is all but disappeared off the internet. It got hacked by like some Russian hackers, and I don't understand what's happening. That apparently, like the University of Ohio or Ohio State, I don't remember which one, is trying to rebuild it. But anyways, he interviewed, there were these short, it's interesting because it's not too different than what we're doing right now, right? But he interviewed all these writers and really got their stories in about, I think that the radio show was only about 15 or 20 minutes, but the full length uncut interviews were available as MP3s on the internet. So the whole things without even with all the outtakes. And so I learned pretty quick. I just used to listen to those, and I listened to probably all of them, or close to anyone whose name I recognize, and lots I didn't, I listened to. So I had a pretty good idea of what it was going to take, how long it was going to take, how many rejections I was going to have to deal with, and that all of that would just make it hopefully sweeter when things did work out. And but it gave me a pretty realistic idea of how tough it was going to be, and just getting my first story published, I think, took 3 years to get a short story published of me submitting, and I used to try to submit, I'm trying to remember now. Because you really start out, for me, I took this kind of traditional path of submitting short stories to journals. And the idea, and I don't know, I think I might have been at the tail end of when this was still such like a known as one of the ways to do it. I just don't know if it's still, but it worked for me. And it was you publish in these journals, and then hopefully agents and people like that read the journals, see your work, and are interested in maybe working with you. And that was an alternative to just kind of cold sending out what they call query letters to agents and those kinds of things. And also you can start trying to publish short stories and kind of building this publishing resume before you have a novel. And I think it took, to give you an idea, I think I've submitted probably 550 stories total. Not that I've written 550, but 550 separate submissions of those stories, and probably had 25 stories published. So I don't know what the percentage is on that, but it's not great, right? And so every single one of those that wasn't is a rejection that you get, And I remember other authors in the old days, it was all done by mail. And now, thank God, there's online submission things that make your life a little easier, because in the old days, you'd have to print it out and send it off, and it cost money to print it. It cost money for the postage. And then you waited months and you got back a rejection slip that might just be, because they were saving paper, it would be like one little line, like they printed the same sentence like 100 times and then cut it off. So it's one little line in an envelope that says, we're sorry, but we're not interested in your work. And there are authors you talked about, they would just paste them on their wall of their office, and their office walls are just completely pasted over with rejection slips, right? And there is something, I guess, that was probably heroic to me in those stories of dealing with that much rejection, right? Like, it's not just you're going to get rejected once, you're going to be rejected hundreds of times. You have to really learn how to fail, I guess, with writing. And that was something I had to learn how to do. I hadn't had a whole lot of failure up until I really started writing, because I'd done well in school. The way my brain worked, it's not that I'm like really that, it's just the way my brain works, school wasn't that tough, And so I just didn't have to fail quite as much as I started failing when I started writing. And there's this idea of that you fail better, right? Like every rejection is one step closer to publication. Every failure you take something from and makes you one little increment better. And I tried to remember that and know that it was a long journey. Um, and so, yeah, that was something that, kind of was with me from early on. But, to this day, I've turned in novels that my editor doesn't necessarily like, or I turn in a novel to my agent that he thinks isn't good enough. And then I have to go back, not to the drawing board usually, but it's a kick in the gut. I mean, you spend 3 years working on something and then your editor says, I don't think it's good enough, or they just don't like it or something. And then, I mean, it's a good kick in the gut, I mean, it's, and most of those no one even knows about, it's not like I post on social media that, all that much to begin with, right? But these are, for the most part, private failures that take place in private and you only talk about later when you're out of the hole of them, because you're not prepared to talk about it when you're in the midst of it, So, I mean, it does sometimes seem like a constant battle, One thing I have learned that I've told this to students I haven't done a ton of teaching, but I have done some. And one thing I've said is that one thing I found is that that you can write well when you're in doubt. You can be feeling doubt about your abilities. You can be feeling doubt about the project you're working on. You can be feeling doubt about whether any of this will ever work out. That does not mean that what you're writing isn't good. On the flip side, you can also be on a high and think you're writing like the greatest stuff that you have ever put out, and then go back later and find that it isn't as good as you thought. But there's a Georgia writer named Harry Crews that kind of got this reputation as for kind of this rough South stuff, almost redneck exploitation, some people called it. His stuff is just wild. I still enjoy a good bit of it, but what I enjoy more than Harry's actual work was he was really articulate in what he said about a lot of things about writing. And he was in it. There's a number of interviews out there. And his number one thing was get in the chair. Nothing else matters except that you get into that chair and you write, And for me, that's an everyday thing. And as long as you get in the chair, you're going in the right direction and things, have a better possibility of working out. So that's something that's really stuck with me.
It's amazing, man, because I think about, and I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. It's kind of awkward for me to say this because we've known each other long before you're a professional writer, but as someone as talented as you are in this regard, and someone who everybody in our class knew, like, Taylor's a really good writer, even with that ability at a young age that you probably earned yourself, you still have to go through the tribulations.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. Yeah. It's funny, I guess, that, I just assume that people know that. But most people don't know what, writing and being a writer isn't a super common thing. And we're all isolated from one another. And I'll tell you, that has been one of the things that was the hardest that I didn't think of with 2020 and now 2021 has been that at least, I have these other writer friends, but I don't see them usually except at some conferences and book events. Well, all that's been canceled for 2 years. So I haven't really seen them in person. And it's not like we talk to each other on the phone, really. There's a little bit of emailing and messaging, but it's not the same as like sitting at the bar until 2 a.m, catching up on what our lives are like doing this crazy thing that we do and commiserating, and not just commiserating, but also coming together and unifying about, our experiences and gaining strength from that. Because it can feel very isolated that, I'm just in this office, and it's great to be able to work from home and to largely work from yourself, but it's isolating too. And so, there's a lot of doubt and fear and hardship and tribulation with it to this day. I mean, yeah, I would say. But my hope is that also that keeps things interesting. And, if you get too comfortable, you probably, it's easier to lose touch with the characters that you're writing about. Right. And Most of my characters aren't in super comfortable positions, right? Or they wouldn't be in a good story. So it all makes it, a better story. I didn't just start writing stuff and it was good and it was getting published. That is not the case. I mean, my initial stuff was terrible. And I wrote 2 novels before Fallen Lands, that will never see the light of day because they're just bad. But I had learned from other, interviews and listening to people that was not abnormal. So I thought I'm just gonna, get into it and go after it. And if I have to write a couple of novels before I write one that's good enough to have a chance at publication, that's what I'm gonna have to do. That's what you do. Now, I didn't just think the whole time they weren't good enough. I mean, I certainly had hopes, but I also realized when I got a little bit farther along, and they take long enough to write, that, you can start to realize almost, you're better by the time you get to the end of it than you are at the beginning of it. So you can see the weaknesses a little bit more and stuff like that. But it wasn't like I started out with a good batting average. That's for sure.
At the same time, you weren't trying to fail, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying my hardest with all of my guts and soul to succeed.
Was there anything else? Again, there's so much we could talk about in regards to everything you've talked about your career and these stories. I can't wait to read Wingwalkers, and would love to bring some wine into the picture one night. This podcast started as like the hard part to actually try to explain how difficult it is to create something that's sustainable that you can make into a career. And now it's called Jason's Conversations because the hard part sounded like a cop out. So you don't have to say anything inspirational, but is there anything else you want to add?
Nothing necessarily comes to mind, but it does seem like that theme really, I didn't really know that that's what the theme was, but it is funny that, what we've talked about has really hit on that theme, and that the difficulty of creating something that is sustainable. But I have done it now, and I am doing it. It is possible to do. It's probably harder than you even realize it's going to be. Sometimes it takes longer than you think. And it requires, I don't know, I do come back to this idea of just keeping the faith, that the direction you're going in will lead, not necessarily exactly where, things don't necessarily end up just how you envision them, right? But that it will take you somewhere, and it will pay off in some ways. And putting in the work on a daily basis. And just that idea of getting in the chair, that to me has been probably the one biggest thing, is that I don't leave any of it up to just inspiration. It's discipline, right? It's like a practice. It's, to me, going to write is not too different than probably, someone who's very into jujitsu, for instance, it's a daily practice almost. There's very few things that they allow to get in the way of going. That is an anchor to their life. And it is super hard, and there are all these distractions and all these stresses and all that. But if you can keep that discipline to work on whatever it is, whatever that project is, some period of time every day, and let nothing get in the way of that, good things tend to happen. And you realize that how much does get done when you work on something every day, right? Because people ask me, kind of, how do you get so much written? And I'm like, I don't know. I just do it every day. I don't necessarily do it for 8 hours a day, but I go to the same cafe at the same time of day, and it happened. There's almost nothing that gets in the way of that, right? I mean, and good things tend to happen if you stay after it like that, and so it's not, to me, that much different than an athlete that trains. That you have to have that kind of, I think, almost Olympian dedication to it, to whatever it is, to really take it to where you want to go,
Sure.
So that's something that has kind of stayed with me. And if, and it becomes comforting, for me, it's comforting to have that as a daily kind of, it's almost like something that your life is centered around. It's a mission.
I'm thinking about parallels with actually apparently Russell Westbrook's routine when he plays basketball is like
Mhm.
super detail oriented and almost to the point of being, he's like really anal about
Right.
how exactly he does things every time he plays,
Yeah.
which got a lot of respect from me.
Yeah. I was just reading the same thing about this cycling champion. I was reading this memoir and this idea that, he puts on he does all these little things the same way before every race, right? And it's almost like a ritual, right? And to prepare for every race, the days leading up to it. And there are a lot of parallels sometimes, I think, this between the world of athletics and the world of creativity, believe it or not. You can't just wait for inspiration to show up. Faulkner said that something very similar to Harry Crews. He said, yes, I wait for inspiration to strike. Luckily, it strikes at 9 a.m. sharp every morning.
Yeah, yeah.
What he meant was that he shows up every day at 9 a.m., and it'll tend to, inspiration will tend to show up if you're there, And so that one always stuck with me too.
Yeah. There's another philosophy, Mark Manson, who's written those non-self-help books like Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fucking. I think everything is. I'll just stop saying the F word. Everything is effed. Let's just say that because I know my mom's gonna be one of the first people who watches this.
Yeah.
One of the only people, maybe. Hopefully for you, a lot more people. But his point is motivation comes from action, not the other way around.
Yeah.
He says that a lot in his books, and
Yeah.
turns out that's true. You can look at it. You can try and look at it the other way, but you probably won't be able to do anything that's that hard.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. There's another book. Have you ever heard of a book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield?
Huh?
Yeah. You know that book?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Somebody gave me that book back when I was living in Nashville, and that's one that has stuck with me. To actually read it at one of the at UNCW, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, which has a great creative writing program. That was the town I was living in before. And I did their visiting writer. I was their writer in residence for 1 semester, and they read it there in some of the core classes. And then AJ just read it. I gave it to AJ to read. And I feel like everybody who reads that book really takes a lot from it. And a lot of the stuff I'd kind of not learned already, but it really spoke to the mentality that I had already created probably, or that I had already somehow formed for myself when I read it. But it just was like, yeah. It just resonated like, yeah, that's spot on. So anyways.
Yeah. And sometimes it's great to hear the same thing different ways.
Absolutely.
Somebody did very well in business told me that. I was like, okay, now I have some validation for reading a lot of like personal development books that all say the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It keeps it fresh, and it's easy to forget. For some reason, sometimes it's easy to forget important lessons. I don't know why humans do that, but
progress.
How often I'm in a thing, I'm like, wait,
Yeah. What I was gonna say, progress generally looks like this. It's not like that.
Yeah.
God knows it has been in my life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Same here.
Well, dude, I'm gonna stop the recording. So that's the end of the interview. Hope you found that conversation as insightful and as entertaining as I did. Everything we discussed in the episode will appear in the description below the video or in the podcast show notes. And consider buying Taylor's next book on pre-order. Remember, it's called Wingwalkers. Thanks again for stopping by, and I'll see you next time on Jason's Conversations. Used to be called The Hard Part. We changed the name so as to expand our reach. See you next time.